So let me, it's my prerogative to direct the first question to Todd. If the model, if an economic model says that, based on all of the factors that you've got in there, that a particular consumer ought to be using mobility services rather than owning a car, and he continues to own a car, is he irrational, or are we missing something in the model? And I say that seriously because you mentioned in the paper some of the the downsides of ride-sharing services. You've got to wait. Certainly, there is a value of privacy. Certainly, there is a bit more flexibility. You can leave exactly to the minute when you want. Is this a rationality, or do we need to build some of these softer variables into the models?
So Mark, that's a great question, and one way that I often respond to that actually is that instead of living in houses, we could live in tents, right? It'd be cheaper. And so there's not, this whole thing is not necessarily just driven by the economics in terms of like declaring whether or not one thing is economically rational versus the other, and we can't just claim that it's rational simply based on whether or not it's cheaper. That's not necessarily the question that I'm trying to answer. So I totally agree with you that there are questions of safety and convenience and such. I would say that sometimes the convenience aspect might actually get overblown with personal car ownership. If you use mobility services correctly, I could order an Uber or Lyft right now and never wait. I would see it arrive as I'm walking down the stairs, and I get immediately into the car. And so I would push back a little bit with some of it, is that so with the rationality thing, I think you're on point, but actually with some of the convenience stuff and some of the softer costs, I think as we begin to learn mobility services more, they're actually adding services that we don't often necessarily recognize the value of. I mean, we are spending actually quite a bit of time even just walking to our car or fueling our cars, maintaining our cars. All those things are completely hidden, I would say in general, from the way we think about our personal cars. And there is real value to recapturing that time. It's just really subjective as to what that time is worth. And so we have to kind of leave it up to the user in terms of trying to figure that out. And I'm happy to talk about more how we leave it up to the user if we want.
Todd, is there anything you think unique about Austin, or do you feel that the results that you saw there are pretty generalizable to the rest of the country, the rest of the markets?
Yeah, that's so like folks in mainstream economics, we talk about validity on internal and external. And I think one of the few things that we picked up in Austin is that, well, these may be peculiar to Austin, really. And so again, I think that's one of the key caveats, saying you got to be careful if you're trying to kind of see whether you could replicate this elsewhere. As I mentioned, I don't think this would be the case in San Francisco. I think any city with a decent public transit system, we may not pick up what we're picking up in Austin, really. Mm-hmm. And I think it's funny that you mentioned that that you asked that question. So in January at TRB, we ran into some folks from the Land Transport Authority in Singapore. And they said, oh, we saw what you guys did in Austin. Can you come and talk to us? Because Grab is fairly big there now, even though I think Uber has now rolled into Grab. And so they're thinking that, okay, if for some reason they have to kick Grab out, which they never told us that, what will be the impact, And I think one of the few things we've seen is that, well, actually, what we see in Austin will not even remotely be the case in Singapore. And so I think a lot has to do in terms of, number one, how the degree of the substitutability between public transit and then TNC services. Then secondly, actually in terms of how visible they are, how thick they are on ground in terms of like the public transit, bus stops, the functionality of it, and that we may not be picking up what we see in Austin, either in San Francisco or somewhere in New York City or in Singapore. So it may be context specific.
And finally, just a question for Jacob. I guess in the paper you got reasonably strong results on car ownership and reasonably strong results on emissions, but not on fuel use. Any theory why, or is it just one of those statistical quirks?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's actually something I glossed over in the presentation. Not only did we not see statistically significant results for fuel use, we didn't see results for VMT or some of the other emission series that we modeled. And I think gasoline use, we trust the data set that's coming from the US DOT. It's the tax receipts reported by states. So there's a line from V for Vendetta, any government's best records or its tax records. So that does apply here. But what I think is complicated is that there are net effects happening here. And when we look at the state level, all we can examine is the net effect. And there might be, you saw that slide teeing up, there are mechanisms at play that could be depressing gasoline consumption. So if you're moving to more efficient vehicles, that may in fact reduce the amount of fuel used. At the same time that's happening, you may see effects like slight increases in VMT that we couldn't detect again because all we can see is a net effect. But if in particular vehicles you do see an increase in that vehicle use, that would increase the amount of gasoline used. So on net, if you're using real world data historically, and you have two effects that roughly counterbalance one another, we will see that zero net effect. And I should say, because we have economists in the room, simply because we don't detect an effect in our econometric model certainly does not mean the effect is not there. So I'll disclaim that for those who I know are going to call me out for that otherwise. But yes, thanks for the question, Mark.
Any of you have questions for each other? Don't want to hog the panel here.
Well, maybe I'll ask a question of Teo first. So we already talked about the representativeness of Austin, and I think you saw in our model we were trying to tease out a difference in effect in urban versus middle versus rural states. Yeah. I think when you talked about differences in populations, you talked about differences in city populations. Have you thought at all about how folks in the suburbs or the exurbs would use the service differently, if at all? And I think anecdotally we know they might use it less. But I would be curious if there's a way to go at those populations in particular so we understand if there's a gradient effect, what that might look like.
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question, which again may be driven purely by the public transit architecture. So I think a couple of years back there was some development in the city of London where even there was a Canadian lady that was chosen as the night czar. And so I think London was trying to promote its nightlife. But the London rail system stopped running, I believe, around 2 a.m. And so what happens is that organically you could see that the TNC services were picking more rides up in the peripheries compared to the core. Okay? And then you find that one too, whereby at least to some degree where the bus stops are in the suburbs that the TNC drivers tend to do much better. But then finally, I think even beyond that, in terms of either the technology or the availability of the public transit system, it may just be driven purely by attitude, And so again, we've seen this over and over again. So there was a funny, statement made by Margaret Thatcher, the former prime minister in England, saying, "A man at 26 who finds himself on a bus is a failure." And I think we need to move away from that, whereby people do not see you if you're on a if you're on a bus, as if maybe you have a DUI. The attitude needs to change, and I think, except we move some of those towards that, there may not be radical shifts. Either you live in the urban core or you live in the periphery.
May I follow on that one quick? I think you're hitting on something really important here with the discussion of what region you're in and whether or not transportation network companies and public transit and the like play well with one another. And from our estimates, again, these are just estimates. If you're driving on the order of say 14,000 miles or more every year, and for context, the average American's driving around 13,000 to 14,000 miles every year. In fact, there's a distinct split between women and men. Women are around 11,000, men have often been around 16,000 miles every single year. If you're driving up in that range, 14,000 plus, it's very unlikely that transportation network companies are going to be economical for you. So the people often that I'm talking about with this, with the model or the work that we've done, are often people that are driving fewer miles than that, and that gets into this discussion about the design of our cities, as well as whether or not we're sort of in suburbs or ex-suburbs. And if generally those are often correlated with higher VMT for an individual household, it's really unlikely that people in the suburbs of Houston are going to be able to satisfy all their transportation needs with transportation network companies. So there's this really interesting aspect of sort of the regional characteristics, which we hope to get into in more detail in the coming year.
Okay, one more question for Todd, and then I'll turn it over to the audience if anybody wants to line up. You mentioned several times just how important the value of time is here. And how do you think about it? I mean, how do you put a value on the time spent as a passenger as opposed to a driver in a vehicle? Is that a full value of time? Is it a partial value? To just kind of talk about how you think about that.
Sure. So when we use the model, right? I mean, the first thing as an engineer who does a lot of work in this space and many other spaces, I think it's often really interesting to first test the most extreme scenario. And the most extreme scenario that you can sort of imagine is that we're pricing our time to almost exactly to what our wage is. And so we have distribution curves, right, from the Social Security Administration in terms of reported wages, and we can roughly tie that to what a hypothetical value of time might be in the most extreme scenario. But of course, there's a lot of discussion and a ton of literature on value travel time savings with the Department of Transportation and others that suggests that the general literature might say that it's about 50% of actual wages is really how people begin to price what their actual value of time is. Now, of course, there's a time dependency here. So if you're rushing to work, then actually your value of time might actually be even higher. But if you're just casually coming home from work, or you're casually going to maybe your son or daughter's soccer game, which actually won't be casual, you're gonna need to get there. So, but you could imagine a casual scenario, then maybe it's really 50% or might be even less. And so the purpose of our study is first test that extreme bounds. Now in the work that we're about to submit for publication, we do bring into account like half value of time to try to understand. And in that scenario, the sort of half value of time, half value of being sort of half of wage, you still get into this realm that about 10% of the US population would be better off. So it's still pretty significant. And then I'm not even accounting for some of the subjective aspects. The subjective aspects we try to bring into by giving the public interactive tools. So one of those interactive tools is actually something called riderdrive.org, which we built in partnership with the Department of Energy, that allows you to go in and enter your own number. So what do you think is your value of time? And then it'll begin to help you be able to look at some of those issues.
Okay, let's take some questions from the audience. Tim?
Ride sharing is a big unknown on future mobility models. And Uber has an option where you can share your ride with a stranger. I personally am not too fond of that. I like my privacy, and I might not want to have a stranger sitting next to me on my way to work. Did you see any insights on ride sharing in your studies? How popular is that, and what do you think of it?
Yeah, so we did this survey over a 2-month period, okay, late 2016. But it wasn't as if we used recall memory per se, because, but we said, okay, before these folks left town, did you ever share your surveys? And what was your own assessment of it? And so you have like Uber Pool and then Lyft Line. There wasn't a whole lot of it then. And I think partially it may be driven by the matching algorithm, okay? But I think those have gotten much better in the past 18 months. And so you have a scenario whereby, I could recollect I was in DC, I believe 9-10 months ago. The red line was down, and I was staying in Silver Spring. And so I would just take Uber, and you're right, early in the morning, I'll just go by myself. But coming back, I can afford to, and you just say, well, you're riding with Sarah, it doesn't bother me. I think there are rules, so maybe you take a cue from the person who came in before you. If he or she is not talking, you don't talk. So it doesn't really bother me. And I think a lot of folks come in, really, where, and I strongly believe that this is where we may see some inflection point driven by the demographics. You know, I think a lot of the millennials don't really care whether they choose to like ride their share with someone or not.
If I could add to do that, as a millennial, I will point out that we're a very, very heterogeneous group, which is something that doesn't get said enough for like these, but thank you for calling us out. Two things I wanted to mention, and I agree with what Tayo said 100%, apart from the millennial comment. But it's a very good question, and with specific respect to the energy and emissions outcomes that I talked about, ride sharing is a potential for a huge win. Right? So if you can get an average load factor of 2 people per vehicle, you have suddenly reduced all of those outcomes you care about by 50%. Add one more person to the car, you're 67% down, right? I think it's great that Lyft and Uber offer these options, and actually the last time I was in DC, Uber now has an option, I forget what it's called, but there's Uber Pool and there's like Uber Pool 2, or whatever they call it, and you wait 5 minutes. And you wait 5 minutes because Uber is going to do an optimization that's going to get you into a car with someone and save them money. And they're profit maximizers, good for them, that's what they do, but in the process, they also reduce energy consumption and emissions. That's a big deal. So I think observing that these business models are new and they are learning is exciting because combining these TNCs with ride sharing could be a huge win. And I also wanted to mention, I think Tayo's right. Right now, there are only informal cues about what that ride is going to be like, and the anxiety associated with not knowing who's going to be in the car might be reason enough not to use the service. So in France, there's a service called BlaBlaCar, and it's inter-city, but if you're in Paris and you want to go to Marseille and you don't want to pay, you sign up for a ride on BlaBlaCar. And it's called BlaBlaCar because you rate yourself in terms of blahs. So if you get in the car and you don't shut up, you're 3 blahs. If you want to ride in silence, you're 1 blah. And it's been successful over there. And I think they have launched a US website and it's been less successful here, but you can envision with sufficient market penetration, you could actually subset your market and maybe increase your net profit because more people participate, even with that distinction by do I prefer to talk or not? Good question.
Yes.
Well, I was initially going to ask, microeconomically, how would you predict that the increase of Lyft/Uber use would impact the price? Would companies monopolize it and make it become incredibly expensive, or would it become more accessible to the average Joe?
If you guys don't mind, Todd? Yeah. So we struggle with some of these issues where you have a market with strong network and externalities effect, okay? And where, in a paradoxical way, for you to be competitive, you want to have the behemoths in the room. You know, I mean, that sounds, that runs contrary to the conventional wisdom. So what Jake just mentioned now in terms of these matching algorithm only works well with fairly thick markets. I mean, otherwise, that will not be the case. So, but getting to that sweet spot in terms of how big is big enough, I think might take, maybe you do like kind of a meta study. Try this out in multiple cities. See where the sweet spot is, which may not be generalizable, but I think it will take some trials to get. The good thing with market is that market works in a fairly brutal way, but it does work. If there's anything, maybe kind of some downside, maybe on the equity issues, that is left for the policy folks to deal with. But market sure does work. And my own preference is that when you see a space like this, step back. Don't overly police it up in terms of regulations, yeah.
Can I add to that? I agree with Tayo again. I think thinking microeconomically on the demand side might have been where the question was coming from, but if we think on the supply side too, if you have very few people requesting rides, potential drivers are not going to make very much money. You're not going to have very many drivers, and to get them to come out and drive anyone at all, you have to raise the price, right? So I think that's another reason that aligns with the narrative we already heard. As the number of people willing to use the service increases, you can charge less because a driver will be busier, such that the volume will make up for the lower margin per trip. So I think both on the supply and demand side, you see why that works. Yeah.
Agreed. The only thing I would maybe continue to emphasize in it is that all works really well in a robustly competitive marketplace. Yeah. And so having multiple service providers helps make that whole system thrive. transportation network companies are in a situation, though, where, and there's some interesting discussions on this about how well you can have a robustly competitive marketplace. Because if I'm flying from here or from Austin to, say, Detroit and then into Ann Arbor, I don't want to have to download a new app, right? I just want to use Uber or Lyft. Because it's so much more convenient. And so that means maybe this is a marketplace where really we're gonna just see the emergence of maybe one or two or maybe three major players over time, and that gets into questions about whether or not it's gonna be robustly competitive. So we'll see. I think the customers, we have to basically help self-regulate that marketplace. If it doesn't make sense in terms of our value of time to use the services, well then just like what was noted, well then the service might end up, the price may be driven down over time. So.
Can I add a curveball to that? 'Cause
Yeah, of course.
I agree with what you said. If we had a single provider and we had a regulated single provider, back to my comment earlier about allowing for time for system optimization, once we segment the supplier, we can't find the global optimum, right? So you might be coming from the airport via Uber, I'm coming via Lyft, we could have come together, but they can't detect that, right?
That's true. I guess it's the degree of optimization that you're interested in.
Right.
Because I agree with you. If we're trying to optimize transportation for all 300x million people in the United States, then like really optimize it from an engineer standpoint, then yeah, you would almost have to have a single point. But if there's got to be some threshold where you have like asymptotically approaching added value of optimization. So totally on board with you. We
Yeah,
could go on and on.
if you really go in the regulated monopoly way, there's a whole series of inefficiencies that creep in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in some future era of autonomous vehicles, what happens to TNCs and the value of time and total cost of ownership?
Yeah, so I think how I will go first, but just speak to just the broad picture. I think this is really where the savings, both in terms of efficiency, even like effectiveness, really comes in. I think if we could get to kind of, if you look in terms of these tier system with autonomous vehicles from 0 to 5, where you have a fully autonomous vehicle, maybe kind of on the x-axis, and then you have like maybe peer-to-peer in the real sense on the y-axis. I think the real sweet spot would be the top right-hand side of that quadrant. And I think that is where you find monumental savings, really. If you get to a point whereby these cars are fully autonomous, and you have a scenario whereby they could just roam and people could ask for it, we get to a point whereby even the whole ecosystem changes. You need to have insurance not for individuals, but for the vehicle itself. Okay? And I think things would change too. Things would change even in terms of, I was just having a word with one of the speakers saying, does it really make sense to have a 6,000-pound object to drive a 120-pound person around? And I think you see drastic design in some of the way cars are really being designed now.
I will note and kind of build off that the autonomy question, I think particularly about last year and the year prior, there was a lot of discussion that shared autonomous electrified transportation was going to significantly drive down the total number of vehicles that we need in the United States and arguably around the world. Like Tony Seba's Rethink comes to mind, right? About like talking about driving it from 200 plus million vehicles downward into this like sort of 80 million or lower range. I actually think it may very well go the opposite direction in the sense that autonomy, which may be in part what is being implied, it recaptures all of the value of time. And so mobility service companies, and I did it very purposefully, right? Think about their business model. It's you hand them cash, they hand you time. That's what they're doing. And so if I have an autonomous vehicle that recovers all of my time, I'm not quite sure I would actually use mobility services. And so the question then is just at what price point can we get fully autonomous vehicles down to the point where is it actually accessible to the general public? I think some real quick back of the envelopes that I did, and many people have did, I'm not claiming this as my own, but if you can sell a fully autonomous vehicle for around $120,000, it still makes sense for mobility service companies if they can get rid of the driver, basically. I say get rid of the driver very lightly. I don't mean that, roughly. But you get what I'm saying, right?
What does lighter
so,
mean?
Yeah, exactly. So, but $120,000 car, that's inaccessible for people on a one-time go spending on a vehicle. Now, if we can get that down further, then you get an autonomous world, and at that point, I don't know how much transportation network companies are really competing, because now I have a car that does everything that they could have done value for me anyway. So it's an interesting world 10, 20 years from now.
My question's about millennials. No. So I'm Jeremy Mahalik. I'm from Carnegie Mellon University. My question's for Todd. You mentioned you had a newborn, right? So I was wondering this, 20% or maybe 10% of the population who would benefit from switching to TNCs, what portion of them have kids in car seats and boosters or other situations that make it not really a feasible alternative for them?
I totally agree, and actually this builds off what Mark, I think, was mentioning at the beginning. That there are a lot of these soft sort of cost questions, and again, this millennial joke and concept that's kind of running as a thread right now. Even not too long ago, there was a lot of discussion about, millennials aren't even getting driver's license, they're not wanting cars, et cetera. I think now as the millennial generation begins to move into their mid-20s and early 30s, and they begin to have kids, and they potentially move to the suburbs because they're looking for affordable housing, I suspect they're going to want to be able to drive. And so that then builds in this whole question of, I have a 10-month at home, and I have a car, and I keep my car seat for her in the car. Now, I can hire an Uber or hire a Lyft, and I can put that in the car, but there is an inconvenience. And so there are consumer dynamics here that aren't totally represented in this, and that is why I guess we do try to emphasize as much as possible that I'm talking about I'm talking about economic advantage. I'm not talking about people will adopt this, but I very specifically say whether or not it's economically advantageous for people to do this. But there's a balance there, right? Because going back to the joke that I mentioned earlier, we could all live in tents. Well, that doesn't make sense either. We're not going to do that. So the question is just like, how do we, within the uncertainty bars that we have, how close can we get to an estimate of future behavior? Because there's going to be these situations. But one last quick note on like the blah blah thing. That's also real. It's an interesting observation about how companies will market segment products for individual people. If you get to a world where nobody can ride around because everyone has kids and Uber and Lyft aren't providing it well, maybe somebody gets creative, an entrepreneur figures it out. What that solution is, I don't know. If I knew what the solution is, I'd be going building that company right now. But it may happen. So I think those are things we need to watch out for, or not necessarily watch out for, but be aware of. It's just hard to quantify right now.
Sorry, let me just quickly follow up on the question that you asked, and with a strong caveat that we take a look at a lot of this question from the prism, from the U.S. perspective, and I think we need to be careful about that. We're roughly 330 million here. Things are done radically differently in Europe, So, I mean, you have a family. Let's say you're going to school in the morning, and you see typically the mom with 2 kids, all of them on a bicycle with maybe like a tandem, right? Something like that, And I think, again, it really underscores the fact that we need to move away, have a whole different attitude, and I think there could be radical shifts whereby maybe that's true. Maybe those folks are only moving to the city. It is just a blip. Maybe they will go back to the suburbs. Maybe not. I think I would not be surprised if we do not pick that effect up 5, 10 years down the road. I would not be surprised if, even with a family with kids, they just say, well, I'll just rent a zip car, which I could drive by myself if there's a need to. They may choose not to drive a car. It's not impossible.
Hello, my name is Kyle Reddies. I'm a Kettering University student representative, dual degree in mechanical and electrical engineering. Thank you for your time. Appreciate the opportunity to ask you a question. Understanding this section is about economics, environmental, and energy assessment of emerging mobility systems. What are your opinions on clean mass transportation, specifically in applications such as high-speed rail in a suburban setting? My question also, I have another question for Mr. Davidson. In terms of your value of time, what do you believe the cost of Lyft or Uber and sharing rides as well as mass transportation for high-speed rail, how cheap does that have to be before people find it more advantageous to utilize that system? We get on a plane, so to speak, with hundreds of people sometimes that are strangers, and we seem to not have a problem with that, but when it's 4 strangers in a Lyft or Uber, sometimes there's a little bit more of a insecurity. So what does that value have to bring to, in terms of time savings for it to be attractive to general society? Thank you.
Sure, maybe I'll make a couple quick comments, but then certainly pass it off. I think the public transit question is an interesting one. People like trains that run well, is just it's the truth. I mean, it is fun to go to Europe and ride around on nice trains that, or at least like say in Switzerland, that run on time. But so there is a human dynamic there. I think there was a study in the past saying it was almost just the like stepping up onto a bus actually like has this psychological result that like we don't want to do it and we'd rather just like walk into a flat train. I mean, there's really bizarre small things like this about how we can like essentially increase the comfort level of using public transit. I will note in terms of like the energy intensity, people talk about the challenge of say decarbonizing flights. Well, we could, if we wanted to, use high-speed rail that satisfy a lot of flight challenges or basically flights from one city to the next. Now, those questions I actually don't think are so much consumer questions. I actually think they're political questions. It's about getting the political will to basically move in a direction that we want public transit. Of course, that's easy for me to say because it's really regionally dependent. It's really dependent upon the design of existing cities. If you have really far, I'm from the desert Southwest, most of our cities are spread really far. It's a challenge to build fixed rail systems that make any economic sense. Whereas maybe Europe, older world, it makes a lot of sense. So that value of time and the comparison of where we're willing to spend that time, we can recapture all of our time if we use public transit, but we have these bigger sort of political challenges that we face in terms of making it happen.
So, sorry, let me just quickly follow up on that. So there is a funny saying the futures of cities is past. And I think that is really true, that the futures of cities is past. So we do a lot of work in the smart cities arena. And the issue that you raise, keep raising it ugly over and over again. If there is density, maybe we could make it work. If there's density, maybe we could make it work. So that's why in Australia, you wouldn't find trains. And even if you find them, they're not the best, okay? So even though here we're talking about transportation, we're talking about economics, as Doug mentioned, there is a land use kind of a dimension to this. I mean, there are maybe like building codes issues tied to this, but then the issue becomes where do you draw the boundary? And Todd is right. I mean, I think it is purely. Does the appetite exist to make sure that maybe if there's a rule that says you can build that kind of discourages urban sprawl, will people adhere to that?
There's one more aspect that I think is really important that we need to touch on. I want to talk, I'm going to take my engineer hat off and put my policy hat on. There's the 5 E's of policy analysis. I remember 4 of them, so I will talk about 4 of them for you. So there's, yes, there's effectiveness, there's efficiency, there's equity, which has not come up yet at all, and is a huge additional important reason to have mass transit in addition to the fact that it can be clean. And there's what I will call expedition. I've called it political expedience in the past, but evidently that has a negative connotation. So effectiveness, transit does for the most part what we need it to. We have designed the system to achieve what the policy says transit should do. In terms of effectiveness, though, it's general understanding that we can be more efficient with the way we spend public dollars. So is that redesigning the transit system? Maybe. Is it taking advantage of another system that could be near zero carbon, alternative powertrains, some version of a shared mobility that is publicly supported so it's flexible and still moves people around in a way that public dollars get people where they need to go? You still check that effective box. Maybe you check that efficiency box, but are you still checking the equity box? I don't know. And so you'd have to be really careful there. Are you checking the expedition box? Almost certainly not. So we've already heard about reasons that would be a difficult proposition, but you're increasing the number of decision makers now beyond I am a transit authority to all of these people that comprise that system and decide I'm going to loan my hardware to that system and allow you to move in it or not. So I think we will see big changes to the transportation paradigm, but how that does or doesn't affect transit I think is still hugely uncertain, but it's a good question.
Terry Phillips. I'm assisting a bicycle technology startup. And bicycles are taking off globally more. 12 billion in the US now, going to 42 billion in 2023. Urbanization, millennials, again, there goes that word, are moving into the city, throwing away their cars and riding bikes. You have electric bikes that have grown 95% in 1 year. So there's clearly a substitution effect, even though your apples or oranges are still all transportation. Have you considered bicycles and also bicycle rental and ride sharing, which has been hit or miss, good in DC, not so good everywhere else? Have you looked at that in your business model as far as transportation in the future?
Yeah, so we're doing something exploratory with Uber now, purely exploratory, where I think purely from a self-preservation side, they see the need to embrace multimodality. You know, again, it's, as I said, self-serving. Because when you see like the first and last mile, they recognize, okay, there are ways by which this could be coupled purely in an organic way with, let's say, folks just hopping on their bike. And even from where we stand in terms of having sustainable and resilient cities, I think there's a need to move in that direction. But it may take some fine-tuning here and there. Copenhagen, they had an experiment 3-4 years ago where they observed that once your trip is more than 2 miles, people don't want to bike, even though it's a very bike-friendly city. You know, to say if we could just modify bikes whereby the effort you have to put in, even for like a 3-mile journey, would be like a 1. People may choose to, there could be a much higher uptick of bike use compared to even getting on buses or kind of a private car. So you're right. From where we come from, I think there's a need for that from a sustainable perspective, that we got to embrace multimodality and move in that direction.
One quick comment is our model, we were focused on just the specific of private car ownership versus conventional mobility services, TNCs, so picking you up in a car. But I will note of interest, right, if you're not aware, Uber acquired Jump Bike basically just, I guess it was a month or a month and a half ago or so. So this is real. They view it as not only a competitor, but also an opportunity, as was just being noted by Teo, that they need to be aware of this, as well as e-scooters, which is why I noted earlier. There are other ways to get around a city, particularly on these short-haul trips.
If I could generalize your comment, I think it's a good comment about bikes, and I do agree, the bikes, and then remember, Todd's last slide was the electric scooter, which have taken off everywhere, right? But there's this idea of vehicle right-sizing, right? So not only can you sometimes take a lighter mode by taking a bike instead of a vehicle, but for the times you have to run to Home Depot or run another, personal freight-intensive trip, if you're using a bike most of the time, but then occasionally you need a car, and then even more infrequently you need, I don't know, a pickup truck. If you knew you could buy into a business model that could get you all of those when you needed it, you might be able to use that bike that much more often.
I have two. Sorry to be that guy. But Todd, real quick, on the 20% number for when it's economically advantageous to change to multimodal, do you have that broken down by city? Because I was wondering, I mean, there's a suggestion that Uber may be profitable in 2 or 3 cities. We don't know until they go public, and I wondered if it tracked with that, high density areas.
Well, so we're looking across the United States. Our effort this next year is to take a more regional look at urban centers in particular, and maybe do a couple case studies in between them, and then hopefully get, if we can, get enough resolution to even see down to the zip code or census level type deal to actually see where this really makes sense. I would note that the numbers that we're using right now are the reported fare prices that from, say, Uber and Lyft, and in reality, if you look at taxi prices, they're significantly further to the right on that chart that I showed. And so if you actually begin to take those into account, we drop more into this sort of 5 to 10% realm. But so this is the challenge that we're facing, right, is that that's what they're offering right now. So it is actually economically advantageous for a lot of people. But if this profitability question comes into mind, particularly if they go public this next year as they've announced, and they have to drive profitability, then at what point do their fares potentially creep up? And then maybe it's no longer as effective for as many people.
And then in terms of reducing like deadheading miles for passengerless vehicles, I didn't know what your thoughts were for either reducing VMT or even potentially, I understand even fatalities may have been increased. If you favor either taxing VMT or pickup drop-off fees, or if there's any thoughts on like infrastructure changes, because you know, there's even like a sign out here, like Uber, it's literally like a fold-out sign, but we don't have any I haven't seen any city infrastructure changes to accommodate. You know, I think a lot of Uber drivers drive just to drive rather than sit, so that, you know, they don't get pulled over. But I didn't know if there was any other suggestions on the policy end.
I don't have a specific policy in mind. Economically, if I were driving for Uber, the best thing I can do after a drop-off is to wait and not waste my fuel until I get another ride. But you're right. I think we've observed several times that both passengers are not always rational economic actors, but drivers may be the same.
Well, but I would actually maybe add an interesting asterisk to that, which is that if you could wait as long as parking is free. And there's a David Shoup art, right? If you're not aware of it, the classic book of high cost of free parking. There's parking is a whole conundrum in and of itself. But I would note that if we do some quick back of the envelope, right? If you have a car that's 25 miles per gallon and you average 25 miles per hour through the streets, that means you're going to be burning gas at 1 gallon per hour. That means you're charging yourself basically $3 per hour. Well, in a lot of urban cores, parking might be more than $3 an hour. It might literally make sense economically for you to just keep driving around and make traffic worse versus trying to park somewhere. And so there are some cities where parking may be less than that, but maybe gasoline's $2 and your actual mile per gallon is 40 or 50. So literally you may end up in almost in no scenario have these people park. They may just keep driving around because it's cheaper to do.
Okay, last question or last question?
Okay, great, thank you. Dr. Lauren Knapp, I'm a research fellow at the Energy Institute here. Thanks so much to the panel, everyone, really great comments and presentations. So that comment is the perfect segue into my question, and I'll keep it quick because the reception is imminent. Which is, so I recently came across a solicitation from the government to essentially revamp the National Household Travel Survey, right? It's been going on since the 70s-ish, and it really helps national policymakers and all of us understand how far people travel all the time. So, you know, they're thinking about big data, and they're really trying to understand better, you know, essentially this, what you're talking about today. And so if you guys could just offer some thoughts on what you would suggest to include in a new and a better national household travel survey. Is it using cell phone data? I know you didn't talk about this, but I'm just curious if you could just think out loud for a moment. Is it, you know, developing an app for this? Is it, you know, connecting with Lyft to really understand all of those miles that they travel to go pick up a person and you know, actually having attribution for a person for those extra miles that they just waste. So what are your, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Thank you. So I think this is a conversation that would take like at least 2 hours. I mean, so let me just kind of hand wave to it. Both for the NHTS and even for the PUMS, the public use microdata sample, some of those questions are asked too. Obviously, the NHTS is much more detailed, where you have a diary and then they kind of track you for like maybe like 1 day. I think where they need to start from is even in terms of categorization. What bucket do you put these things? You know, I mean, often even maybe, I mean, as late as 2015, these services were put under livery services, you know, the kind of classic taxi. Meanwhile, things have moved radically away from there. So I think even in terms of which bucket do you put, these things are really, really key. And then secondly is even how best to unbundle, the dollars that goes into this. So if I buy a shoe from Zappos, maybe for $113, kind of the fulfillment service of someone taking it from the warehouse to my house is kind of in some way reflected in that. There are ways by which those could be like kind of unbundled so that we have a really good sense in terms of what goes to my shoe in the real sense of it, and then what goes to the fulfillment services portion of it.
So I agree with that. I think incremental change, just keeping the mode separate. I think they asked about ride sharing for the first time in 2017, but then it was reported out as taxi rides, which is not useful for those of us who want to distinguish it from taxi rides. So it's on the radar, but it was reported out the wrong way. I'd say the gold standard, I heard you mention cell phone data. I know Argonne National Lab and Lawrence Berkeley National Lab are working with Verizon and AT&T, or AT&T Verizon respectively. They anonymize cell phone signals. They follow us all day, and all of you know that, right? Privacy is not a thing anymore. And other comments that I will save for the reception. But they can impute based on how fast you're moving, and they do this in San Francisco. Are you walking? Are you biking? Are you riding transit? Are you in a personal vehicle? What is traffic looking like? How many trips are you taking each day? And you have, with both of them, you have 40+% of the population in a way that is a large enough representative sample that you know how everyone in town is moving. So do I think DOT is going to be able to do that? I would guess not, unfortunately, because I think that would give all of us in this research community everything we wanted to know. But I would say minimally, keeping new mobility rides as reportable separately, and even if there are folks trying to minimize the size of the survey, because I know that's how they think about this, if those numbers are small now, being able to see what that growth looks like over the 4 to 8 year increments between surveys matters. But yeah, there is a gold standard that others have implemented if they need to look to them, but that would be great.
Okay, well, I think we need to wrap up. It's awfully easy to be a moderator, and we got a panel that's this well-informed and this engaging, so let's everybody give a big hand to the panel.